Greetings, it is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the various campaign settings of Dungeons & Dragons, many of which date back from Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Let's continue today with Spelljammer, Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in Space, the first one I choose to start with. Alright, we talked about gravity last time. Let's talk about gravity and combat this time. Because theoretically speaking, when if you are within a gravity plane, it should not generally interfere with combat. When you are outside of gravity, when you are floating in the space itself with no gravity though, you have to worry about getting penalties to fighting because you are not ready for it. Now this means you're traditionally a non-native. Non-natives receive a -6 to attack while out, a -6 to initiative while floating in weightlessness, and they also get -2 to all their attacks. This traditionally translates into something like disadvantage to both of those when it comes to 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, rather than AD&D. Now, what we mean by non-natives, it means you weren't born in space, either you haven't had a lot of experience with weightlessness, or you're just not generally trained in combat. All these things will mean you are not set up to fight in weightlessness. You're basically unfamiliar with fighting in 3-dimensional space. Now, most natives or people that take a special proficiency do get the ability to be able to manage this. Effectively, you train yourself to be able to fight in weightlessness. Now, as I said, traditionally gravity fields don't do much to interfere with attacks, and this is especially true when it comes to missile weapons. When you're firing within a gravity field, it should have no effect whatsoever. When it moves out into the weightlessness of space itself, wild space, it's actually even better for the weapon itself. There's nothing to slow it down at that point in time, so the weapon will just go on forever. Game terms, this means that your actual extreme range, the farthest range you can fire away is as far away as you can see. That's actually true. And this extreme range is going to be -10 to your attack. That's what it's really going to be, is you just have that maximum. Now, this doesn't mean it gets there in one turn. What it really means is if I fire this weapon out, it will travel up to its long range every turn until it reaches this extreme range of your vision. So, you do have quite a distance you can fire away and see. Again, it will take a little time, so it's not always the most accurate at that extreme range. But if they're not moving for that entire period of time, well, blunk, you hit into them. This means many people take into account this when it comes to just not only the basic ranged weapons that people are firing out in space, but also when it comes to any kind of siege weapons. Many are designed with the fact that they will be flying through space for a period of time in mind, that they will be taking advantage of this and not slowing down until they run into gravity again and hit the enemy ship or enemy object that they're firing upon. It is important to note that wild space functions exactly the same as the phlogiston when it comes to this, when it comes to gravity like this, except you do have to worry about the fire and explosions when it comes to the phlogiston, when it comes to whatever you're firing out. Now let's move on and talk about another topic that's important to talk about, temperature, which surprisingly, out in space, it's warm. Now you may ask, why is this? Well, planets can generate heat, stars can generate heat, and oftentimes there are multiple portals to the plane of fire within a crystal sphere / crystal shell that will allow heat to be out into this plane, because there's nothing preventing it from basically emanating out from these portals. Traditionally, most places in wild space have a temperature of about a fine summer's day. Now, this does actually vary from shell to shell. You can find some that are much hotter and much colder. This is usually a balance between how many stars may be there and how many basically portals to the plane of fire might be there. If there's less of these numbers, or even no, it's not going to have the same amount of heat as if it would have a lot. The phlogiston is actually at a similar temperature, very comfortable, but in that case you do have to worry about using things like fire, which could cause explosions, so you might have spikes in temperature, just violent spikes in temperature, but otherwise, generally speaking, the phlogiston is also at a very reasonable temperature for you to travel in between, that you don't have to worry about the heat itself. It is very important to note there are no seasons in the phlogiston or wild space. Now, if you are within wild space and you are approaching a star, Think of it as if you were traveling in amongst the plane of fire. The plane of fire is a hot, damaging place. It burns a lot of stuff. If you're traveling there, you usually need some kind of planar protection. That similar kind of protection will protect you from the heat and fire of a star itself. Also, similarly, you can find water planets that are frozen over. You can see that there is a variety of different worlds based upon the basic elements of the universe here, of the 4 primal elemental planes. Now, time. Time varies from planet to planet, space to space, because they all measure it differently depending on their days, their rotation, how they rotate around the sun, everything like this. However their rotation is, determines their seasons, determines their time period. Spelljammers have to have their own standard in order to avoid getting confused at a lot of these places. In a place that might have a 20-hour day, another place might have a 15-hour day, and then you go to one that has a 40-hour day, and heck, you're just getting confused. Spelljammers use a standard 20-hour day, and then they have, of course, they divide that up into 3 shifts when they're on ship. A first shift, a second shift, and a night/graveyard shift. This is going to be their traveling shifts. Now, of course, also you have to consider the fact that they use these days in 7 days a week, 4 weeks to a month. We don't have any more standards after that for a Spelljammer. A Spelljammering crew will not look to years after that, because years are traditionally more better for judging seasons and such, and a rotation around a star. That's not as important in space. Judging your months that go by is. Now, this doesn't mean that people won't judge years, but usually this generally goes down to the crews and individuals. Most people will look to between a 10 to 15 month year, and they will judge that accordingly. But this also means that most people won't have always the same year, though, again, the Spelljamming crew should have a similar measurement of basically when it is in the course of a month. Now, we have talked a bunch about classes and characters and races and building characters in space. We've talked about ability scores. We have talked about most of the races in space. Now, I am going to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to talk about some other topics starting next time. But for a little bit more right now, I did want to mention that whatever planet that you're using, whatever basic campaign setting, if you're using people that begin as groundlings, they could really be any race. Because the fact is, I've talked about all the major races in space, but around any of these individual planets, for example, Toril and Faerun, this location will have, within the space of it, all the races that are present on Toril. This is true. All the intelligent races should have some kind of membership up in space. It might be very small membership. It might be very minor, but it will exist there. So really, you could choose any race you really want to, and that race will act as if it's from that planet. All these races, including the ones in space, their class options will be equivalent to whatever class options are for that race. So basically, any kind of setting, any kind of information about that race is going to be, generally speaking, the same planet side to space side. And this is especially true of the minor races. Now, we do want to talk about one more race which we really haven't covered a lot, which I have talked about a little bit, but I want to mention a little bit more about it. Lizardfolk. Because they are very savage on most planets. While in space, they're as good as any other race. These bipedal reptilians are about as intelligent as humans, as halflings, so they aren't really brilliant. But they are smart enough. And they go from about 5 feet tall to 7 foot tall. They have this scaly skin, which can generally be from a kind of brownish green to a very light green. When the spacefaring ones like to get excessive tattoos and use a lot of body paint to decorate themselves. They tend to actually be short-tempered and very emotional, with little patience for the warm-blooded types. In fact, their name for all the other races is actually derived from an old lizard folk name for prey. So you can see they have these echoes of the old kind deep within them. Now, alignment-wise, lizard folk tend towards actually neutral, with a little bit of leaning towards chaotic. But truthfully speaking, they could be any alignment. You can find lawful ones, you can find good ones. You can still find evil ones. You can find really any alignment as an option for a lizard folk within space. But that's it for today. I went over some more information. I started with talking about how gravity affects your combat, because it does. In particular, I talked about fighting and weightlessness, which really, if you're trained at it, you're okay. If you're not trained at it, you get some penalties. I talked about using missile weapons when traveling between gravity and into space, and how it's got insane range, but at that range, if it's not moving, well, you're aiming at a spot deep over there, and, well, it's going to take a number of rounds to get there. Yep, number of rounds. Granted, you could try to lead the shot, depending on how far away it is, but that's a chance. I then began talking about some other important aspects. Temperature. It's actually warm in wild space, and relatively comfortable in the Phlogiston. Then I talked about time, because time is different everywhere. But Spelljammers, those that accrue the Spelljammers, they have their own standard, those that travel in space. It only goes up to months, the standard, because they keep it simple. And because years aren't important to them as much. You don't have to worry about seasons or rotations around a star or star rotations around you. Seasons just don't exist the same way. I then finished up by moving into a little bit more character information, and this time diving a little bit into the Lizard Man. Talking about them, because I really haven't handled them very much. I have talked a little bit, but not a huge amount, because they are different than their terrestrial counterpart. In the next episode, I do want to cover a little bit more about Lizardfolk, and then I want to talk about magic in space, because I did talk a little bit about some earlier, but I mentioned I would be diving a little deeper into it now. And then I'm going to talk about the act of spelljamming for your characters, as well you, as a character, spelljamming. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, a link in the description below. There's some great rewards there. It helps to grow and improve the channel. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.